Hello, music makers. Welcome back. I still get questions like, what are the best drum samples to have? Or what is the best synth, etc., etc. And I always feel bad because those asking those types of questions are always going to leave disappointed with my answer, which is of course going to be something like, it depends. Never what you want to hear when you're trying to learn something. But I think today's video will really help a lot of people. Today I'll be breaking down a full track, but the focus is going to be on direction. For when you have direction, most of those beginner questions automatically get answered. Let me explain. So the subject of today's video is a track by Hayden James. Now, whether you're a fan or not, that actually doesn't matter. This lesson is universal across all music. One of my viewers, Ryan, DM'd me asking about the song Do You Want Me? He was struggling to figure it out, and I'm not surprised, there's a fair bit going on in there. But his answer to the next question was the important one. I asked, what do you like about it? He replied with, I like to listen to this stuff when I'm taking a break from tech house. Aha, there is our seed of truth. I know it sounds like a perfectly innocent answer, but that is actually very important. You see, as I alluded to earlier, what most new producers lack is an understanding of direction. What do I mean by that? Well, go on this little thought experiment with me. Imagine our name is Hayden James, and imagine we would like to be a DJ. But we are smart. We have noticed that tech house is a really crowded area right now. And maybe we have also noticed that not a lot of females are dancing or even going to those kind of gigs. What could we do to separate ourselves? What would an antidote to this guy look like? Or should I say, sound like? What if all of our decisions, sound selection, sound design, chords, groove, arrangement, what if all of that was chosen in service to this idea? Do you see where I'm going with this? This is what makes a good producer. Having a plan. Now, I'm not saying this was the actual plan for Hayden's brand, but as I break down this track, just pay attention to how every single sound or chord lines up with a strong direction. Okay, let me give you a brief overview of a couple of the main sections. Obviously, if you're not familiar with the original, there is a link in the description. What you'll be hearing here is my recreation. Here's our intro. Nice smooth pad chords. The vocal is just AI ripped from the original, by the way. Obviously, I'm not going to remake that. Let's go to the verse. Nice bounce, very subtle bass and subtle electric piano type thing. Here's the pre-chorus, the pad comes back in. Bumpy bass swaps to pad bass, joined by a guitar and a lead. Here's our chorus. What's to talk about with this arrangement? It's almost an anti-drum. Even though it's stepped up from the verse, it's actually still quite chill, which is deceptively hard to do. So you could say the direction here is chill or deep, pop, house, maybe. Let's look at each aspect, chords, sound design, etc., and see how it contributes to achieving that direction. First of all, let's look at the harmony side of things. Key, scale, chords, all that good stuff. So this track today is in D minor. Here's our 7 notes of D minor. Now, I've not done my usual trick of displaying everything in A minor, so we could just use all the white notes and then transposing later. That's partly because I'm lazy, but also D minor isn't actually that difficult. D minor is still all the white notes except note 6. Our B here is a B flat, or A sharp, same thing. And this track never moves out of scale. It's what we call fully diatonic. So hopefully that is straightforward enough for everyone to follow. Okay, so that's our scale. As for the chord progression, the entire track is based on a 4-1-6-7. And it's 1 chord per bar, so let's do this. There's our 4, 1, 6, and 7. And if we build our basic chords on top of those, it looks like this. So 4, 1, 6, 7 in D minor. And it sounds like this. The only exceptions to that progression are in the intro and the break. Where there's no 6, it's just a 4, 1, 7. Okay, speaking of the break and intro, here are the chords from that. So here's our 4, 1, and 7. No 6 just yet, as I mentioned earlier. Let's build the chords. Whoops, this sounds a bit crunchy. Let's put these up the octave. There we have 4, 1, 7 in D minor. The first 2 chords have 7ths on them. Now, one of the running themes of this track is it's quite floaty and chill, and chord extensions can help with that. Personally, I hear triad chords as very direct, even trite in certain circumstances, and extensions can help dilute that a little. Now, our last chord here isn't a 7th or a 9th, it's actually a 6th, which is this one. Very floaty, I think you'll agree. In terms of voicing, our root notes go down an octave. What else? Well, remember, this track's supposed to be chill. So this 7th up here gets moved down the octave. That means there's no big jumps. It creates this common tone here as well. This note here, which looks like it would have a nice voice leading line downwards, actually gets moved up the octave. Instead, this note is held over, because that's the same as our root note down here, so that works in the chord. And that acts as our leading line going up. In the final arrangement, it looks like this. It's repeated twice, slight rhythmic variation. And at the end is this little build thing. What you're hearing now is a Rhodes, but this has been doubled with a sine wave synth and a saw pad underneath, which you'll hear in the arrangement a bit later. In the original, I'm not sure what plays this part. Could be the guitar coming in, or it might be the Rhodes itself. It's all under a filter, it's hard to tell. But its job is to lead into the verse. Little rhythmic push on the second repeat. Clearly a way of picking up the pace and the energy. As you can hear, we're coming into the verse. The drums are filtering in. So that's our intro and break sections. Here is our aforementioned verse. So, this is what I heard. I'm confident this is around 95% accurate. My relative pitch is pretty good these days, but that doesn't mean it makes any sense to me. You see, from a keyboard player or piano player's perspective, none of these note choices or the sequence of notes make much sense. So for that reason, I'm inclined to believe this is not a played part, this is a sample. Most likely chosen for the vibe, the aesthetics of it. And I also think the sample has been chopped up. Because it's essentially repeating the same chord every time with some slight variations. And I think whenever this top note is present in the chord, they've used that as a rhythmic accent. Now, some of you may be thinking, how can it be repeating the same chord all the way through? Didn't I say at the beginning this was going to be a 4, 1, 6, 7 chord progression? Yes, I did. Technically, it is, because that is where the bass is moving. As for the resulting harmony created by this part above it, this is one of the reasons I think it's a sample. Let me show you what's going on. So this is the chord that runs all the way through. It's basically a type of chord 6. It's got a 7th on it. Let me build a normal chord 6, like that. So it's basically an inversion of chord 6. If you take the root note and put it up one octave, you get this chord. Now that's fine, but that runs all the way through. What's changing is the bass. And if you saw my video on why samples in the same key don't fit, you will have learned that the bass dictates the chord regardless of what is above it. And the bass starts on 4, then it moves to 1, then the bass is on note 6, and lastly it moves to 7. As I said, it's based on a 4, 1, 6, 7. Now, for the first and the third chord in this sequence, these bass notes do actually fit with the chord above. Because if you take chord 6 and put note 4 underneath it, you just get chord 4 with a 9th extension on top. And obviously, the third chord in the sequence is chord 6. So bass note on 6, that works fine. It's just a different voicing of that chord. So all good. However, when it comes to chord 1, this is where it gets weird. In a minor key, you can't really put a 6 extension on chord 1. Well, you can, but most people would just consider this an inversion of chord 6. This close clash here makes it a lot more unstable than its major counterpart. So this means even though we have a bass playing note 1, we never really get a settled or at rest version of chord 1. It's always got this clash in it. And as for chord 7, well, if I was to give this chord a name, it would be something like a C, 6, 7, 9, sus 4. Or maybe you could view it as chord 6 with a 9th extension, but the 4th inversion of that. Yeah, well, in other words, not normal chords in the traditional sense. Whatever names you would want to give them, I would call this weird. But weird as they are, I don't actually hear these as too jazzy either. The fact that these chords aren't actually moving anywhere, like we saw in the Sammy Virgie video with lots of clever leading lines, there's none of that going on here. I think that's actually adding to the floaty, chill vibes. It's not drawing attention to itself. And we will discuss sound design later, but I think it's worth pointing out the fact that the sound is very soft and the bass sound is very soft is helping mask those clashes a lot as well, keeping it nice and chill. As I said, I think this is a sample, chosen purely for the vibe. The bass was probably already done, and this just happened to fit over the top. And if that was the case, I have just spent 5 minutes completely over-explaining everything as usual. Let's move on. Speaking of the bass, here it is. So it's just playing short notes every 8th, and the groove, the bounce, is coming from the side chain of the kick drum, so every other note will be louder, and also this early push to the next chord in the first bar and the third bar. And lastly, this little gap here. And that's pretty much the rhythmic template for the entire track. Nothing mega sophisticated or syncopated, but that's perfect. Remember, this is chill. The last thing we need to talk about from the verse is this little background melody ARP thing. I can hear that little melody going on behind the chord part. As you can hear, very subtle. That's why I've not spent too long on the sound of that one. I can't actually tell what's playing that in the track. Although the guitar does seem to join it occasionally, like in the pre here. In the verse, it doesn't sound like a guitar is playing that part. It's too quantized, too digital. So I've just made a generic pluck sound for that section. As for its function, well, momentum, it's carrying the same rhythm as the chords. 8th notes with that little gap. And background melodic interest, I suppose. As for the notes, this is what we call a pentatonic melody. A pentatonic scale being 5 notes. The minor pentatonic scale cuts out notes 2 and 7 from the normal minor scale. As you can see, all these are either 1, 3, 4, 5, or 7. It's also adding background interest to the chorus. Originally, I presume this to be something inside of the original key sample for the verse, just something in the background. But I can hear the line on its own in other parts of the song, so I do believe it is a dedicated part. Nice little detail there. Okay, let's look at the melody. What's that doing over this verse? Here's the notes being sung. Nice melody. Any of you who have watched my old melody videos might notice a question and answer structure here. However, some of these note choices make me believe this vocal was not written to this backing track, which happens a lot, actually. Most vocals which are sold in the industry are usually written to a basic demo track, one which is often made by the vocal artists themselves. And then the producer who takes the vocal will often make a completely new thing around it. Anyway, let's have a look. Let's move this melody up an octave so I can fit my chords underneath. So our chord progression is 4, 1, 6, 7. Let's build the basic chords. Okay, that lets us see the notes inside. So let's look at how this first bar lines up. If we put a 7th on our chord, in fact, those verse keys made it a 9th chord, didn't they? Anyway, you can see how the melody lines up here. These notes, F and D, that's all fine. This is just a passing note. No problem, makes sense. The majority of those are in chord. Now, this one is a little strange. Note 4 over chord 1. Even our weird chord 1, which would be this. This is a very strange place to land. This is one reason I think this vocal wasn't written to this backing track. It's either that or this is a natural reaction to how unstable that weird chord 1 sounded to the singer. Note 4 on chord 1 would make this an 11th extension over chord 1, which would be more fine if the rest of the notes were in the chord underneath. So certainly unusual. This part is fine, it's just a typical pentatonic run-up. We land on the 7th of chord 6, which is perfect because chord 6 was already a 7th chord. No problems there. These are just passing notes down to the other note of the chord. Then we land nicely on the middle note of chord 7 here. And then the melody resolves to note 1 of the scale, that D. Technically, that's a 9th of that chord, but the resolution of the melody is the more important part there. So, mostly making sense, apart from this one outlier over here. Okay, let me give you an overview of the pre-chorus now. First of all, the bass moves to long notes. The pad from the intro is reintroduced. But this time it has chord 6 in there. Remember, it didn't in the intro. Our vague electric piano verse part carries on here as well, as does the background ARP melody, and that's also joined by a guitar. Another new guitar part joins and plays this thing. That's just playing a lick on note 1 and note 7. That's played with what we call palm muting, giving it that plucky sound, adding to the rhythm and pace. It's 99% on note 1, which does fit over most of these chords, but its job is clearly to add some tension and build-up into our chorus. Also introduced here is the lead. This sound later becomes a kind of answer part in the chorus, but it's introduced here obviously to lift the pre out of that verse energy into something new. Nothing unusual to report in terms of note choices. All these notes are from the bass triad chords, so those slot in without any problems. The strangeness, again, comes from our vocal melody. There. In bar 3, let me show you. Here's the notes. Sounds fine on its own, but this choice of note, this is note 2. This is the other main reason I believe this vocal was written to a different track. Because I have never encountered a vocalist that, when presented with chord 6, would choose to sing note 2. Hopefully you can hear what I mean. Very strange choice indeed there. Listen again. Weird, right? Now, I'm not saying it's bad in any way. It's not really spoiling the vibe too much because it's sung in a very floaty, bendy way. And there's lots of reverb on the whole production, so everything's kind of blurring together in that vague, floaty vibe kind of way. So we get away with it here, but it is a direct clash with note 3 here on the lead synth, which is also on a very similar sound and octave to the voice. It would put it right here. In fact, let's solo those two. Yep, those two are clashing. But the vibe is maintained. Anyway, that is our pre. Let's move on. Okay, let's look at the chorus. Or should I say drop? First of all, the bass moves back to that pulsing rhythm on 8th notes. That background ARP thing is still in there. I could hear some additional energy in the low mids, so I've made the guitar play the bass part. This could just have come from the bass sound opening up in the original. It was hard to hear. Something seemed different down there anyway. I just decided to add those guitars. It makes sense as the energy added in this pre-section by the addition of the new guitars wouldn't be lost in the drop. And the energy balance is very delicate in this track. Again, we'll get to that in the arrangement and sound design sections. Here is that lead answer part I was talking about. On the last half of the loop. Just playing these two notes, 4 and 5. Those are different to the pre, and they are not great note choices for the chord, acting more as an answer to the melody rather than trying to fit in the chord. Again, vague harmony. The main new addition and lift to the drop is this swirly pad. The lift here doesn't just come from the sound. The chord here is voiced a lot higher than any previous ones. In the original, it's actually very hard to hear. The effects almost take precedent over the note choices themselves, but I think this is mostly accurate. Nothing too strange to report from note choices here. This is actually very similar to the note choices of the intro pad, just voiced higher, therefore giving us a little more energy. As for our vocal melody, let's have a look at that. The vocal swaps to what I would call a dub-style hook. It's not a full chorus like a pop track. It's just on this "Do you want me" loop phrase, repeated on notes 7 and 3. They're adding to that bouncy groove by just accenting the offbeats of the eighths. And the turnaround here where he sings "Baby, Baby," that's not strictly what I've written here. he's actually bending between a D and an E. In musical terms, we call this a blues note. Let me explain. So this would be chord 7, C, E, and a G. And instruments which aren't constrained to distinct pitches, like the human voice, or guitar, or saxophone, you could play around with this middle note of the chord, thus making it neither major or minor, but something in between. We call that a blue note. Okay, that sums up most of the harmony for the track. Okie dokie, let's discuss arrangement. For the most part, I would call this a pop structure. We have intro with the hook filtering in. Now the drums filter in. And the electric piano does its little wiggle build. Now this is interesting. This little instrumental section before the first verse kicks in here is a departure from what I would call strict pop structure. This kind of thing leads me to believe that this was probably self-produced by Hayden, and or he has a very good relationship with his label. Most record labels and their A&R would insist you remove this gap here. In the non-extended version of this track, this might be regarded as redundant space. In other words, not enough points of interest happening before the main vocal starts. And certainly not TikTok friendly. In fact, the non-extended mix is well over 4 minutes long, which is quite long for what is in every other respect a pop track. In other words, we're not in any rush, are we? We're chilling. Basically the theme of the entire track, isn't it? Anyway, here's the verse. Now, I want to discuss the production side, the decision-making on this arrangement regarding how we manage this build in the pre and the drop. So one of the first big changes is all the bottom end comes out of the track. I've just done that on the master channel, DJ style. Another big change is rhythmically. Many parts have slowed down. This electric piano from the verse is still going, but that's hardly a percussive instrument. The bass swaps to long notes, as does the vocal, joined by the long sustained pad. The lead sound joins with long notes too. The only thing keeping pace now is those verse keys, the background arp, and the guitar that comes in. As I said earlier, the job of this guitar is to build us into the drop. We have a little bit of white noise sweeping in. Nowhere near as in your face as many EDM tracks would be. It's very low in the mix. Little reverse crash cymbal here to help with the anticipation. And a gap. Now, what I find fascinating about this whole production is how it manages to drop whilst still staying chill. Even in the drop, it doesn't go too big. That's not very easy to do. The vocal hook helps. It's not too high or too harsh. It's just on that loop. But the verse piano actually disappears in the drop. And it isn't replaced. There's nothing with that low mid chord energy to replace it. Instead, our attention is diverted to things like this clap reverb. And of course, the big swirly pad. That's a very noisy sound. It's helping with the energy. And there's a lot more busyness in the drum part. Some extra loops are added. Let me show you what's going on there. So drums in the verse sound like this. Nice and chill. There's a very light break over the top of our usual kick, clap, and hi-hat. For the pre, we remove both the bottom end and we remove the busyness by getting rid of the break. This way, it doesn't detract from the new, slower, sustained parts that come in the music. And then we drop with let's compare to the verse. But you'll notice, even with all these loops, it's still not too massive. There's no big, harsh sounds. It's just a little bigger than the verse and a little busier. Now, at the end of the chorus, we have this transition section. Serving the opposite purpose as the pre, so we can get back down to the verse energy. So the noise sweeps down, the vocals are echoed off. The big swirly pad is now being filtered out. The bass is swapped to the long notes, and our rhythmic focus goes back to that subtle ARP melody. Everything else either fading or filtering out. Again, no bottom end in the kick. Reverse crash into nice calm verse again, which is identical to the first. The main change for this second half is the pre. Pre is now kind of built into the verse because the bottom end and the drums stay rolling as opposed to how it was here. So it's like a hybrid. The pad also joins and one of the guitars. And then only halfway through do we remove the kick and the bottom end. No gap this time. Well, there's a gap in the bass, but we roll straight through with everything else. This drop is identical, as far as I could tell, possibly an extra crash cymbal. And then we go into our main break. Now listen to how crucial the vocal is in this transition. The hook fades out early, so we are expecting something different, and there is a carryover line. If I play this back without the vocal first, see how sudden that energy change is? Whereas if I put the vocal back in, you'll hear it stop and then the reverb tail of the new line carrying over. So this is basically just our intro chords with the pre-vocal on top. And then we build with this. So this build to the final drop is taking place with all the rhythmic instruments. Verse piano, the background ARP on both the pluck and the guitar sound. That one note guitar lick as well. Also the guitar that was doubling the bass part is here. Let's listen to that group together. So that's where a lot of the pace of the build is coming from. Obviously, the intro pad is back, so we can use that to filter upwards. Bass is back on the long notes, but the low end is still cut on the master. We don't have this. So just like the pre, we're building tension by removing the rhythm and removing the low end. The lead joins halfway through. The drums are also filtering up. Now the rest of the work is being done by the vocal. You'll notice the vocal line getting more intense, going higher in pitch and also harsher in tone as the build progresses. And the main "Do You Want Me" hook is also filtering in. The filtered noise is back. Notice that vocal energy increase. All the filters opening up. The gap is back. One extra crash cymbal this time for good luck. And to help nudge this above previous drops, the verse piano stays in this time. Also, the one-note build guitar, that also stays in too. That's the arrangement. Okay, let's look at sound design and sound selection. Quick disclaimer, reminder, these are not the original sound. These are my recreations, remember. But still, they should be close enough to learn from. Okay, let's have a look at the drums first. So this kick drum is interesting. It took me a long time to find one like this. The reason this is interesting is because the type of kick we're looking for still needs to have club levels of bottom end, still needs to be very strong down there so it can be played in live sets. But we don't want it to be too long, it still has to be quite tight, and we also don't want one of those aggressive sounding kicks. It's not a super common combination. You can hear in the context of the mix there, it's providing plenty of support and just enough punch, but without a hard attack. As for our upper drums, we have a very tight, short clap. That's the verse. I did add a second clap for the drop, because I found that after I had added enough top loops to lift the drop from the verse, the backbeat had sunk too far back. All the hi-hats, very light. In fact, this is more of a shaker. And the break, that's providing most of our syncopated groove interest. Very light again. In the mix, in fact, you're only really hearing these kind of frequencies. The hi-hats and upper snare wires. Listen out for that in the context of the whole track. It's just adding a little bit of groove interest, but it's not taking over. You may have noticed I had put reverb on that, and some on the clap too. Just trying to match the general ambience I could hear in the original. Helps with those floaty vibes and keeps it in the background. And as for the drop, here is the extra percussion I added. Just trying to lengthen the offbeat, so I got some longer hi-hats and a ride cymbal. And I still needed more busyness, so I added another break. Even with all that though, nothing too big or harsh. It wasn't very easy trying to find that balance between lifting the energy, but not going too big. In fact, we're going to do a sound experiment later, where I show you what this track would sound like with bigger sounds. As for our bass, it's a very simple sound. It's just a saw wave and a low, steep filter. The long note version is on this channel. It's basically the same sound, but I needed a different sidechain, so I've made a new track for it. No change in the chorus. So very much in the same vein as the kick drum, we need to provide enough bottom end. It also needs to provide enough harmonic content because the bass is what is dictating the insinuated chord changes. But at the same time, it doesn't want to draw attention to itself or overwhelm in any way. So it's mostly providing the sub-content and just enough above that to provide support to those chord instruments above it. Let's look at those verse instruments. First, we have the Rhodes piano. This is the free one from Spitfire Labs. Vintage keys, 73. No major processing, just removing the low end, as Rhodes pianos do tend to be rather muddy. That still didn't give me enough similar vibes to the original, so I've added this synth layer. Just made up of a simple patch, sine wave, and this hybrid sine square wave too, just mixed in slightly. Trying to sound like a warmer complement to the electronic piano there. But mainly what did nail the vibe was the chorus. This free emulation of the Juno chorus by Tal. That is all backed up by a simple saw pad. As you can see here, just a saw wave with unison turned on. No effects. And we're using the filter to build. Again, removing some of that mud. That filter build is used in all of the pre-choruses, and the first and last break too. For the verse sound, again, I think I'm emulating a sample here, but this is mostly sine waves. We have a triangle wave on the octave. This one isn't used. A plucky envelope sent to the filter. And these random elements are being sent to pitch. Lots of pitch wobble for lo-fi vibes. Over here, you can see I've made both the filter and one of the oscillators velocity sensitive. If we take a look at the MIDI again, so the ones which are pressed harder are accented. They'll get slightly brighter and slightly louder. Again, just trying to emulate what I could hear in the original. Here's the background ARP. This is a super basic sound, and that's on purpose because behind the main verse sound, you can't actually hear what this sound is. It just has to provide those notes underneath. The sound of this could be almost anything. It doesn't matter. I just went with a basic, what I would call guitar style pluck. It's a pulse width altered square wave. A little bit of that hybrid square sine in there as well. Fairly short, plucky envelope. That line is joined by a guitar sometimes. Now, I normally use free plugins wherever possible, but unfortunately, I couldn't find one for this job. I needed a type of guitar playing called palm muting, and I couldn't find one for free. This plugin does it really well, though. This is by Ample Guitar, the AGF2, F standing for Fender, I presume. Ironically, it does take some knowledge of how to play the real instrument to get the best out of this. But as you can see down here, we have palm muting, PM. So that's what that plucky guitar sound is called. If we put it on normal sustained guitar, you get this. Completely different, and not what we need. Also quite important is this instrument lets us select the pickup, which is these things on a guitar. They affect the sound drastically. This switch on a real guitar lets us select where the sound is being picked up from. And when you select the neck pickup, which is this one here, you get a much thicker sound. So that's the only paid plugin I've used in the entire production. Just much faster than searching a million samples or instruments. Now, having said that, for this other part, the virtual guitar wasn't sounding real enough at all. Here, luckily, I found a splice loop which was close to the original performance, so I've just chopped that up to provide the two notes we need, and I used that also for this part in the chorus. I did double that with the virtual guitar. Those are doubling the bass notes in the drop. As I said earlier, I could hear some extra low-mid energy in the drop, so this is how I did it. Now, the drop pad. This is interesting. This is very hard to make out in the original, and I think that's actually the point. Most of the energy is provided by the noise of these swirling modulation effects. So we have a chorus with the feedback cranked, and also a phaser with also very high feedback. Here's without. So clearly these effects are very important to the energy of the sound. Underneath, it's just a basic saw wave with lots of unison. Maximum unison voices with 18% detune. It was actually very hard to hear the notes that were being played on this pad sound. Such was the strength of these modulation effects. It's almost as if those are more important. It's a very clever way of keeping the chill, floaty vibes, but adding energy still. Last but not least, we have the lead sound. A classic synth brass lead, the kind of sound I would associate with the Yamaha CS80 back in the day. Another very easy sound to make. We just start with a sawtooth, very slight amount of detune here, only 2%. Too high and you go into trance rave vibes, so back that off. We want that phasey thinness, and the brassiness comes from how we delay the attack of the filter envelope. You can also do that to the main volume envelope too, but I didn't need to here. Some generic reverb and delay, nothing too specific there. Making sure it doesn't stand out too bold. Those ambient effects helping it sit slightly back in the track. Lastly, let's look at the sound effects. In the builds, we have a little bit of white noise. It's literally just white noise from Vital. I'm filtering that, nothing special. I've capped off the extreme tops and bottoms there with the EQ, so it doesn't get too bright, doesn't get too EDM festival. I ended up running the white noise during the drop as well at a very low level. It still needed some energy after the verse instruments came out. All just ways of lifting the energy without being too brash. I could have done the same thing by merging a little noise in with the pad sound. As you can hear, those two go together rather well. There's already a lot of noise in that saw wave and the effects. There's a clap reverb for the drop. Not a very bright or harsh one though, of course. It just sits there in the middle frequencies nicely. And then we have a reverse crash into crash. You'll see those dotted around the project. They are just accenting the starts of the main sections. You can use crashes to help drops or to transition from section to section. Lastly, I wanted to show you a little sound experiment. I've recreated a couple of these sections, but with different instruments, less subtle instruments, to show what it might turn out like with different sound design direction. Here's what our verse would sound like if we had harder drums and like a more deadmau5 type synth. Here's where we used to be. You're only hearing sound changes here. Not a single musical part has changed. Here's an alternative drop. Back to the original. So hopefully you can hear, even without changing any of the music, the sound selection and sound design choices change the direction. In fact, pay attention to the vocal. You'll notice the vocal no longer sits right. The vocal performance is too soft for this production now. My instinct would be to try and remove the reverb and distort it. Ideally, you would redo the performance, of course. Here's where we used to be. Also notice how the original now sounds kind of weak in comparison. That's something you have to be very careful of. It's easy to spiral out of control when you don't have direction. Half a dB louder here, half a dB louder there, it all adds up. Hopefully you can see how having a direction before you start can help every single part of the process. Because if the sound choices and sound design all work together, then the writing and arrangement will come together easier. And in turn, the mix will practically take care of itself. All of this means there's less guesswork, and the time between inspiration and finished track comes down dramatically. Well, that was a lot, wasn't it? Hopefully that helped some of you. Sorry the video was late, that was quite the undertaking. If you did appreciate it, let me know the best way you know how. And until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye!